The name Caran Dash is more familiar to most of us as a brand of coloured pencil, but it was first used as a pseudonym by the enormously influential 19th century French cartoonist Emmanuel Poirot. When or why he picked up the alias isn't known, but Caran Dash is a French phonetic interpretation of the Russian word for pencil. Although both his parents were French, Emmanuel was born in Moscow in 1858, and that's where he grew up. In 1877, when he was 19, he emigrated to France, where he took French citizenship and joined the army. And during that time he also contributed caricatures and humorous illustrations to the army journal La Vie Militaire. Once he'd left the army in 1882, he started selling his work to various Parisian magazines, and over the next few years he established a growing reputation for his humorous drawings. In the early 1890s he created Maestro, one of the first graphic novels, but it was never published in his lifetime, and this wasn't rectified until more than a century later in 1999. But although Poirot never got to see his novel published, he was starting to enjoy real success with his other work. And by 1895 his editorial cartoons were regularly published in the newspaper Le Figaro, and a little later in the popular humour weekly Le Rire. Unlike virtually all his contemporaries who were using fine hatching techniques to give solidity to their images, Poirot was more intent on exploring graphic simplicity. It was his bold economic line and application of usually flat colour which gave his images their visual authority and impact, and the effect was more akin to woodcut than it was to lithography. But he was also capable of, and frequently used, a more sensitive linear approach based on direct observation when the mood took him. His illustrations were regularly republished in album form, and these sold well throughout France and other European countries. As the 20th century approached, the anti-Semitic opinions Poirot and others held at that time in France became a growing and unpleasant feature of his work. In the first decade of the 20th century, his illustrations also became more extremely styled, to the point of virtual abstraction. And although he had never been known for his good humour, his images became particularly pessimistic. How far he would have travelled in that direction we don't know, because Emmanuel Poirot died at the age of 50 in Paris in 1909, and obviously his death was premature by anyone's standards. He left behind a body of forward-looking, influential, humorous illustration, and it's a pity the pencil of the same name is now better known. For the life of me, I can't imagine how American illustrator Walter Harrison Cady has remained so deeply buried until now. He was born in Massachusetts in 1877, and in his teens he became an apprentice to a local artist, where he began learning about drawing and painting. But a year later his father died, and the loss of the family breadwinner forced Cady and his mother to move to New York, where he managed to find work assisting in the art studio of the Brooklyn Eagle newspaper. Unfortunately, no evidence of what he did there appears to exist. But his income took a sudden sharp upturn when Life magazine employed him as a staff artist. Around the same time he also began illustrating children's books, and these proved to be successful and financially rewarding. In 1912 he collaborated with the writer Thornton Burgess on the first of what would turn into a long-running series of animal stories, and their successful partnership would endure for 5 decades. He was a particularly evocative pen and ink illustrator, and this technique was the foundation of all his colour work too, whether created with watercolour washes or applied at printing. He had a natural ability with anthropomorphic animal characters, and he was also capable of producing incredibly detailed, complex crowd scenes, which the viewer could study for quite some time and find new amusing narratives within the overall composition. These were a regular and popular feature of his work for Life magazine, usually printed in monochrome, but he created many others in full colour, and quite a few publications were keen to use them to draw the potential reader's attention. In addition to illustrating the stories written by others, Cady also successfully authored and illustrated a few of his own, such as the Butternut Hill series, which began in 1929. In his lifetime, he was best known as the creator of the Peter Rabbit comic strip and the many picture books it led to. The character had first appeared as far back as 1912 in his collaborations with Thornton Burgess, and the strip first ran in the New York Herald Tribune in 1920 and lasted until 1948. These are credited only to Cady, but the books continued to be written by and credited to Burgess. Despite the fact he was a rabbit called Peter, this character had nothing to do with Beatrix Potter's character of the same name. Why Cady didn't just choose another name, I can't imagine. And its popularity seems disproportionate, given that it was far from Cady's most convincing animal creation. But by the time he reached the end of the line in 1973, at the age of 93, Walter Harrison Cady had clocked up an astonishing 70-year career. Robert Stewart Sherriffs is virtually unknown in Britain, and I don't suppose he's any better known elsewhere, so I'm doing what little I can to put that right. He was born in Arbroath, Scotland in 1906, and having shown the customary aptitude for all things artistic, he went to Edinburgh College of Art in 1923. At that stage he was strongly influenced by the elegant Art Nouveau stylings of both Aubrey Beardsley and Alphonse Mucha. In 1927, Sherriffs wisely moved to London, which was home to every major publisher of books and magazines in Britain at the time. And at that time you had little choice but to physically be there to get work. He showed his portfolio around any number of commercial art and advertising studios, and the response was not what he had hoped for. But he also sent caricatures to illustrated magazines, and one of these was accepted by the Bystander. This in turn led to a commission to illustrate a series of celebrity profiles for the Sketch, and these were so successful that from 1930, at the age of only 24, Sherriffs became the magazine's film and theatre caricature. From 1927 onwards, Sherriffs also drew regularly for the BBC's Radio Times, and in 1930 he created a series of remarkable Beardsley-influenced illustrations for an edition of Christopher Marlowe's play Tamburlaine the Great. The highly calligraphic line which defined all his images was created with a brush rather than the more usual pen. Although trickier to master, the brush in Sherriffs' highly skilled hands produced wonderfully descriptive gestural curves and flourishes few others could hope to emulate. When war was declared in 1939, Sherriffs joined the Tank Regiment and later became a war artist illustrating aircraft recognition handbooks. In 1944 he also published his own comical novel, Salute If You Must, which sold well enough but not well enough for him to try again. Returning to civilian life in 1945, he headed back to Scotland for a while and scaled down his illustration activity for a couple of years, producing only occasional illustrations for long-standing clients. But in 1948, Sherriffs was offered the job of film and theatre caricaturist for Punch, so he returned to London and continued to feature in the magazine into the later 1950s. In that same year he illustrated two of Charles Dickens' lesser-known stories, Mrs. Orange and Captain Boldheart. Virtually all Sherriffs' work was created and reproduced as monochrome, but he did break out of this in spectacular style with his illustrated edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in 1954. This series of images doesn't get anything like the attention it deserves. They're highly faceted but beautifully visualised line and wash colour images. And I wish I could tell you how he created the highly textured coloured areas in these illustrations, but I haven't got a clue. And although most of his later work continued to be defiantly monochrome, there were also forays into the use of colour, such as his cover art for Men Only magazine. In the 1950s, Robert Sherriffs' aversion to living and working in London got too much for him, and he returned to Scotland, dispatching artwork by rail to the capital. Sadly, he was diagnosed with cancer in 1959, and he died in 1960 at the age of only 54. Generally, I have very little interest in fashion illustration, but I'm more than willing to make an exception for the distinctive dramatic work of French illustrator René Gruau. He was born in Italy in 1909, the son of an Italian count and an aristocratic French mother. But due to his father's infidelity, his parents separated when he was only 3, and his mother took him to live with her in Paris. Gruau was something of a prodigy, and although he was self-taught, by the age of 18 he was already successfully selling drawings to French and Italian fashion magazines. And in a remarkably short amount of time, many of the most renowned fashion houses, including Balmain, Dior and Givenchy, were keen to employ Gruau's gestural illustrative artwork. He had begun his career when fashion illustration was overwhelmingly under the geometric influence of Art Deco. But his influences were altogether different. He always credited Etienne Drian's revolutionary fashion drawing, which had been popular a couple of decades earlier, as one of his greatest inspirations. But there was also Japanese art and calligraphy, along with the post-impressionist graphic approach of Toulouse-Lautrec in there too. And with his own contribution added to the mix, it made for a unique and distinctive combination. His observational figure drawing was remarkably expressive, and he employed both line and colour very selectively, and frequently with immense visual vitality. Consequently, all his illustrations made for compelling viewing, and more than most could be considered simply as modern minimalist art. During the Second World War, there was predictably little to no interest in fashion or glamour, which wasn't ideal for Gruau. But rather than head off to somewhere exotic and neutral for the duration, he stayed in occupied France and secretly helped to hide Jewish refugees at great risk to himself. Gruau's longest collaboration was with the designer Christian Dior. He was appointed as the company's artistic director in 1947, and the two became good friends as well as business colleagues. At this time, Gruau was at the height of his popularity, and in addition to his work for Dior, he was in demand from many other major clients, including Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. In 1948, he moved permanently to New York, and when fashion magazines began to turn increasingly to the use of photography in the mid-1950s, he increasingly turned to advertising work. And with the glamorous posters and press campaigns he created for major clients, such as Air France and Cinzano, he had no problem at all remaining a significant force in illustration. Like Harris and Cady, his career was an astonishing 7 decades long, but even he couldn't last forever, and René Gruau died in 2004 at the age of 95. And that's it for now, and I very much hope to see you next time for more of the same.